Visit elmhurst.org to explore the new City of Elmhurst website. Find out the latest Elmhurst news, pay utility bills and parking tickets, report concerns, and much more. Elmhurst.org is an ideal way to discover what Elmhurst offers your business, your family, your life.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Elmhurst College. I'm delighted first to welcome back to this campus a distinguished visitor, Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, who has previously visited us during the course of her research and her work in public life, and comes to us this evening as the 2013 Holocaust Guestship Lecturer. Dr. Lipstadt will be introduced later in the program. I'd like to welcome all of you with just a brief word to frame the evening within the context of this college's commitments. The core values of this college, which are given to you in your program, contain one very important one: social responsibility. Social responsibility is a responsibility not merely to perform the works that we do day in and day out here with a kind of conscience and a conscientiousness appropriate to the important work that we do. It's also important for us to look and to remember and to recall the connections that bind us with the past and with the present for the sake of the future. And it's in that context that I understand tonight's Guestship lecture and service of remembrance. Certainly, this lecture has a long history here. Many of you may remember, 23 years ago, we began this lectureship. And every year since, our numbers have grown, and the list of speakers has grown longer, which I think is a testimony to the binding power of community among us, another value of our college. For example, social responsibility in this way has been honored by an annual trip to Washington, D.C. and the Holocaust Museum. In fact, we have with us this evening a number of students who have just returned from a multi-day trip to D.C., and they have participated in a number of very interesting programs in association with their visit to the Holocaust Museum. We continue to work with the Skokie, Illinois Holocaust Museum and to actively partner with other area groups. We also plan on a 25th special celebration of this lectureship in 2 more years, and I hope to see all of you then. And finally, as a way of welcoming you, I would simply like to say that this college is a place of more than memory. It's a place of our living witness. And I think nothing better attests to that than our choice of lecturers year in and year out, who frame an historical event in their own private lives, but far more in the significance of those events, the lives of the past in terms of our future. To begin our evening, I'm happy to call to the podium Rabbi Stephen Bob, our Jewish co-chaplain, and also a founding member of this event. Rabbi Bob.
We created the Elmhurst College Holocaust Guestship because we understand that as a liberal arts college with a church affiliation, we have an obligation to confront the Holocaust. Before World War II, Germany stood at the center of Western civilization. The Western world looked to Germany for leadership in philosophy, music, poetry, and learning. We ask, how could the Nazis come to power in such a place? Why didn't the values of Western civilization prevent the Germans from becoming Nazis or supporters of the Nazi program? Recognizing that all the perpetrators grew up as Christians, we ask, why didn't their Christianity prevent them from becoming Nazis or supporters of the Nazi program? We also ask, what enabled the rescuers to put themselves at risk to protect others? The Holocaust raises questions about the nature of human beings, the value of our society. Facing these questions will enable us to contribute to building a more just society in our own time. We'll continue now with a reading from the 130th Psalm. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. Lord, let your ears hear the sin of silence,
the sin of watching without helping,
the sin of looking away,
the sin of locking order over the doors of those needy.
Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice that I may remember. Speak unto all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. You shall not steal, neither deal falsely, nor lie to one another. You shall not swear by my name falsely. You shall not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not defraud your neighbor, nor rob him or her. The wages of one who is hired shall not stay with you overnight. You shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the mighty, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. You shall not go up and down as a slanderer among your people, neither shall you stand idle by the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall not take vengeance to bear any grudge against the children of your own people. But you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. We'll be led now by Tamar Levinson.
Kadesh for the Holocaust. Let us now pause to recall the bitter catastrophe that befell our people in Europe, when in the past our brothers and sisters were massacred in ruthless pogroms. The poet, Bialik, in his City of Slaughter, cried out against this bloody savagery. Today we mourn not for one city of slaughter, but for many such cities where 6 million of our people have been brutally destroyed. The cruelties of Pharaoh, Haman, Nebuchadnezzar, and Titus cannot be compared to the diabolical devices fashioned by modern tyrants in their design to exterminate a whole people. No generation has known a catastrophe so vast and tragic. The blood of the innocent who perished in the gas chambers and killing places of Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, Majdanek, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, and Theresienstadt cries out to God and to humanity. How can we ever forget the burning of synagogues and houses of study, the destruction of the holy books and scrolls of the Torah, the sadistic torment and murder of our scholars, sages, and teachers? They tortured the flesh of our brothers, but they could not crush their spirit, their love of Torah. The parchment of the Torah was burnt, but the letters were indestructible. In the Warsaw Ghetto, Jews valiantly defied the overwhelming forces of the inhuman tyrant. These martyrs lifted up their voices in a hymn reaffirming their faith in the coming of the Messiah, when justice and peace shall finally be established for all humanity. O Lord, remember your martyred children. Remember all who have given their lives for Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of your name. Grant their souls the peace reserved for all the righteous who are in your tender keeping. And as we mourn our people's tragic fate, we also recall the compassionate men and women of other faiths and nationalities who, at the peril of their lives, protected and saved thousands of Jews. They are among those whom our rabbis had in mind when they taught, the righteous of all nations have a share in the world to come. Let us all pray and work together for that day when there shall be no more violence or desolation anywhere on this earth, when nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Return us, O God, to our task and to our people. Renew our days as of old. Bring back the time of creation. Return us to our neighbors, to those who have suffered with us, to those who still live in darkness, and to those who need our help. Return us and renew us. All of life is return and renewal, is creation after destruction. Akiva walked alongside the Temple Mount and saw the jackals playing among the ruins. And he sensed a divine plan of darkness and light, of a land to be restored, of a people to be returned to God. Our survivors belong to the company of Akiva. We honor and revere them. We are their students. How can we feel what they feel? How can we know what they know? All we can do is to take their silence, and we can take their words and interweave past and present and future, and we can pray and hope. Creation follows destruction, and destruction follows creation. We light candles to commemorate our dead. Soon these candles will flicker and die and return to darkness. Soon we begin to forget, and we must not let this happen. Let us kindle one more light, a Yortzeit candle, to which we return each season, and let us recite the prayer of praise which the poet intertwined with the memory of suffering.
We light 7 candles in memory of the 6 million Jews and 5 million others who were defined out of existence and killed by the Nazis and their collaborators in Europe from 1933 to 1945. In addition to Jews, the victims of the Holocaust included Poles, Roma, Sinti, homosexuals, and physically and mentally disabled people. We light to honor the work of those Jews, Christians, and others who were rescuers, resistors, and liberators. The systematic application of technology to produce assembly line mass death, the involvement of highly educated professionals in the planning and implementation of the killing process, and the complicity in the creation of a humanly disposable society make the Holocaust a defining era. In its aftermath, the world lost the efficacy of the notion of progress, the vision of education as ultimately transformational, the trustworthiness of institutional authority, and the capacity of logical reasoning to solve all problems. We light candles to remember, to question, and to look to our common responsibilities for the care of humanity. When I invite you forward, please come forward and light one of our candles here to my left. Omari Davis. So Ellen Rocca. Caprice Spielman. Wally Lagerway. Susan Sword Steffen. Karina Sutker. Mark Draper. Jacqueline Pearson. I'd like to ask the other students who are with us tonight who participated in the recent trip to Washington to come forward at this time as well. Charles Lunar. We pray silently. Zecher Sadik Livracha, may their memory be a blessing to all. Let us say, Amen.
Chaplain Matheny and I have the privilege of announcing the winners of this year's of the Gerda Lunar Prize. Just a word about Gerda Lunar. As you see from the program, she's one of the founding members of the Holocaust Committee here on campus. And she is an example of one of those poignant stories that so many of us know who have studied the Holocaust. As a young girl being sent by her family, by her parents, from her home in Berlin to a different country, to the Netherlands, to grow up. A few years, I've had the privilege of knowing both Charles and Gerda, and after Gerda's death, Charles decided to honor her memory by the contest that we have each year then on campus. And Charles, would you be kind enough, please, just to stand and be recognized for this is certainly a wonderful example of what this whole project tries to do, that we remember and that we also try to speak to the present generation by the continuation of this prize. Scott?
Here are the titles of the papers that were written for the committee, and then I will call the names of the three who were winners. Shedding Blood, How Lessons from the Holocaust Relate to Contemporary Mass Murderers. Individuals' Role in Eugenics and the Holocaust. Social Justice, Social Injustice and the Holocaust, A Road to Justice. So for our third prize, we recognize Angela Sousos. If Angela is here, please. For our second prize, we recognize Sabrina Ebert. And for our first prize, we recognize Lauren Havrin. Are either of the three of you here? I know they said they had classes and other things. Will you join me in recognizing these three, please? Is one of them here? Are you in the back, Evan? No? Okay. May their writings and may their witness as young men and women lead to further scholarship and further witness to this Holocaust. Cindy?
O se shalom bimroma, uya se shalom aleinu, ve'al kol
And now may the Lord bless us and keep us. May the Lord's face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. May the Lord's countenance be lifted up upon each of us and give us peace this day and forevermore. Amen. It's my pleasure to call one of our faculty here at the college, Professor Nancy Lee, to introduce our guest. Professor Lee comes to us after a PhD in Hebrew Scripture, a Fulbright scholar doing study in Bosnia, and has been a commanding writer in Lamentations, in Hebrew text, and in other areas of Hebrew Scripture. She has been a part of the Holocaust Guestship Committee and has been an integral part of helping us in thinking about genocide and larger issues with the Holocaust. Will you join me in welcoming Professor Nancy Lee to the podium, please?
Good evening. I wonder if we might join together and thank the founding members of the Holocaust Guestship Project and the current committee for all their hard work in preparation for this week. It is indeed a great honor to have here to Elmhurst College Dr. Deborah Lipstadt. She is Professor of Modern Jewish and Holocaust Studies at Emory University. She is a noted author of several recent books: Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory in 1993, History on Trial, My Day in Court with a Holocaust Denier, 2006, and most recently, The Eichmann Trial in 2011. She has been invited by three successive presidents of the United States to serve on Holocaust memorial committees. In her careful attention to the details that comprise the events and the experiences of the Holocaust, in her correction of erroneous myths in pursuit of truth and justice, taking tough stands and bearing a personal cost, in her incisive but fair critique of other commentators, and in her compassionate drawing attention to unsung heroes and unheard voices of victims, Deborah Lipstadt is a force to be reckoned with. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Nancy, for not just the eloquence, but the brevity. It's very boring to sit and listen to everything you've done, because you've done it already. It's a true pleasure being here, and I'm very touched by the service which preceded this. And if I might add a few words in the name of my own rabbi of my own synagogue, Rabbi Adam Starr, that I heard yesterday in synagogue. This past Shabbat in synagogue, Jews read from the book of Numbers, the portion Shmini, which tells the story of the death of Aaron's sons, the two sons who had come forward to try to offer competing leadership in the temple. And the text very profoundly says, as his two sons die, Vayidom Aharon, Aaron was silent. And my rabbi juxtaposed that reaction with something you know so well, Nancy, Echa, the Book of Lamentations, which begins how can we describe, how can we cry out, how. So you have the voice of silence and the voice of those who cry out and everything in between. And I think we saw that represented tonight in that service, both in words and in moments of silence and much in between. I thank you for welcoming me back here. It was 1999 that I was here last, and yet I do remember that visit, and much else has transpired in my life and in the lives of so many since then. But I come tonight to talk to you about the Eichmann trial. And I've written a book. It came out about 2 years ago now, I guess it is, and on the trial in anticipation of the 50th anniversary of the trial, which was last year, and in an attempt to explicate some of the ideas, myths, and impact of this trial. And I'd like to talk to you about it tonight. But first, just often a question comes up, and maybe to preempt that question, what brought me to write this book was really the editor of, it's in a series called the Next Book series, and the wonderfully gifted editor of the series, Jonathan Rosen, turned to me with the idea. It wasn't my own idea. And I said, well, why my connection specifically to the Eichmann trial? And he said, you don't get it? And I said, no, I don't. He said, well, there were 3 markers, and he said many commentators said after your trial, I was on trial, and as many of you know, for libel in the United Kingdom for calling a Holocaust denier a Holocaust denier, and somehow it managed to last 6 years and 12-week trial and very extensive legal battle. And I won, but still it took a lot to bring around to that. He said afterwards, so many of the press commentators, the Times of London, the New York Times, others said there were 3 markers in jurisprudence after the Holocaust: the Nuremberg trials, the Eichmann trial, and David Irving versus Deborah Lipstadt. You've gone through one. Turn your wisdom, your experience back on the Eichmann trial and tell us about that. And I said to him, I don't think there's any connection between my trial and the Eichmann trial, anything that I'm going to be able to look at that trial with greater wisdom because of what I went through. But I'm happy to go back and look at that because it's such a fascinating moment in history. And once again, I was wrong and he was right. It did color my perspective, and some of that later in this talk. But first, who was Adolf Eichmann? And maybe to start with a negative, because often people make a mistake in this. Adolf Eichmann was not the architect of the final solution. He did not devise it. He did not think it up. That was left really to Adolf Hitler and to those around him, Himmler, Göring, and Goebbels and others, Müller and others who were in that tight inner circle. But if Adolf Eichmann was not the CEO, to use common parlance, of the final solution, he was the COO, one of the chief operating officers. He was one of those most responsible for making it happen. At his direct hands, probably 1.2 million people went to their death. He organized their transportation, and he was not just someone, some people like to depict him, well, he was just someone who made the trains run on time. Not at all. In Germany, they didn't have that problem. They ran on time. But he organized the collection of the people, the right number of people to be brought to the camp, that the camp had enough, that particular camp had enough space to absorb them, i.e. to either murder them directly or put them to work and then to eventually murder them, to dispose of their belongings, and to do it with the least possible resistance of surrounding peoples. He oversaw the deportations from Western Europe. He oversaw most of the deportations from Germany, from Greece, and in the final days of the war, final months of the war, when it was clear that Germany had lost the war, spring of '44, was clear. The Russians are advancing eastward. Rome is liberated June of '44, the landing in Normandy. In those that final period, that final year, less than that, in 7 weeks' time, he oversaw the destruction of the last large intact Jewish community on the European continent, the Hungarian Jewish community. In the space of 7 weeks, he oversaw the murder of approximately 420,000 Hungarian Jews. The killing and it's that killing really that gives Auschwitz its distinctive marker as the world's leading killing fields. In that 7-week period in which Hungarian Jews were put to death, the killing was so intensive that the crematoria at Auschwitz broke down. They couldn't handle the load, and they had to create fire pits to burn the bodies. This was Adolf Eichmann. He not only went after large groups of Jews, but he went after individual Jews. At his trial, it was made so clear that there were so many instances where the German Foreign Office would be contacted by the Italian Foreign Office, and they'd ask about a particular Jew who had been arrested and incarcerated because that Jew, in this particular instance, was married to a Catholic, Italian Catholic, whose father was a member of the fascist party, and they were anxious to track down the husband. And as soon as Eichmann heard about this, he arranged for the man to be deported to a concentration camp and be killed. It happened over and over again. Someone would inquire, he would go after that individual Jew. He went after not only the large numbers, but the individuals as well. Before the war, he really devised the whole program of deportation, of how to deport an entire community, strip it of its belongings, and make the Jews themselves pay for it when he oversaw the deportations and the ridding, quote unquote, of Austria of its Jewish population. So he was a central figure and a most formidable figure. And he wanted to keep fighting. When Himmler ordered that the trains, that the deportations from Hungary be stopped, he still got out one more train. When Himmler said it must be stopped, he went to argue against it. He was always pushing for one more, for more, for more, for more. In January, I believe it was, February 45, he talked about what joy he would go to his death at having overseen the murder of 6 million Jews. And then he repeated it again in 1956 when he was in Buenos Aires. So this was a man who was totally committed to what he was doing and was very much aware of what he was doing, in contrast to what Hannah Arendt and others would argue later, but more of that in a moment. The war is over. He wants to fight on, but it's clear that it's not going to happen. He is arrested by the Allies under an assumed name. His fellow SS officers help him escape. He goes to the northern part of Germany, where he works in a lumber company, which has given shelter to a number of wanted SS war criminals. When some of his associates, his closest associates, are arrested and give testimony at Nuremberg, he knows he's got to get out of Europe. He goes to the south and manages to make his way across Europe with the help of a Red Cross pass and with help from the Vatican, and we don't know how high up that help came. And he goes to Argentina. Now, why Argentina? Argentina was not looking for Nazi war criminals. Argentina was anxious to have, as immigrants, as many well-educated or educated Europeans as possible, Europeans, i.e., to augment its white population. And if you happen to have war criminal on your resume, it was not an obstacle to your being admitted. He goes under an assumed name, Ricardo Clement, and he establishes himself there, and after a number of years feels secure enough to bring his wife and his children to Argentina. The official story of his family, of course, is that he is dead and she has gone to remarry and marry someone else. And they go to Argentina, they settle in Argentina. Now, unlike some of the other Nazi war criminals and pro-Nazi expats who have settled in Argentina, he is not a financial success. And in fact, even in the hierarchy of war criminals, he's someone that the other war criminals sort of want to stay away from because he is seen as having real blood on his hands. He was a desktop murderer in that sense. He was a desk murderer, but he was so close to the murdering process that others feel that they sort of, he's déclassé in that sense. Not that they disapprove of what he did, but he was so close to the murdering process that they don't want to have that much to do with him. But the idea that he was there secretly, that nobody knew he was there, is a myth. Certainly those German expats knew. Certainly those other Nazi war criminals knew. Certainly people in the German embassy in Buenos Aires knew. Lots and lots of people knew he was there. The problem was that no one who knew he was there, or none of the people who would have been interested in capturing him knew he was there. And when word begins to seep out from Argentina that he's there, really nothing happens. Well, how does word come out? It comes out in a number of different ways. First of all, there is a family, the Hermann family. Lothar Hermann, the father, is a German Jew who had left Germany right after Kristallnacht for Argentina with his wife. Their daughter is born in Argentina. And she doesn't know that her father is Jewish. They never tell her because they decided once they arrived in Argentina, and this is a commentary on the times, that the world was too dangerous a place to live as a Jew. So they were going to raise their daughter as a non-Jew. And she attends, German is her, the lingua franca of her home. She knows Spanish well. And at one point at university, she meets a young man named Nick Eichmann. She invites him to her home. Eichmann talks to the father about it's too bad that the Germans didn't kill all the Jews. He's sort of vague on what his father did. And then at one point, the father reads in one of the German language Argentinian newspapers that there war crimes trials. Germany's beginning to organize its first major war crimes trials. And the organizer of these trials, the prosecutor, says that if he knew where Adolf Eichmann was, he would arrest him and indict him as well. Well, Lothar Hermann puts two and two together and says, Nick Eichmann, vague about what his father did during the war. I bet this is Eichmann's son, and I bet that's his father. So he writes to Bauer, to Fritz Bauer, the prosecutor, and Bauer is intrigued by this and asks him to investigate further. Now, who's Fritz Bauer? It's all these people sort of from the periphery who play a role in this. Fritz Bauer was a German Jew, a socialist, who during the 30s was arrested by the Nazis and imprisoned in Dachau as a socialist. And when he's released after terrible mistreatment, he leaves Germany, goes to Denmark. When the Germans come to Denmark, he escapes to Sweden. And in Sweden, he's there with other German expats who have also escaped, the socialists. One of them, a fellow socialist, the German named Willy Brandt, who will, of course, go on to be leader of Germany, is amongst those who convinces him, actually, Bauer's pretty willing to do it, doesn't need much convincing, to go back to Germany after the war to establish a fair judicial system and also to oversee the punishment of Nazi war criminals. And many German Jews had no desire to go back to Germany, but Bauer does it, and he becomes the Attorney General, so to speak, of Hessen and the state of Hessen, and in this capacity organizes the the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials and other war crimes trials, and it's that capacity that he's looking for Eichmann. When Bauer, this is interesting, when Bauer gets word from Hermann that it's fairly certain that this is Eichmann, though Hermann is a little bit confused about who it is and comes up with some weird stories, but Bauer thinks it's a really worthwhile lead. You would think he would turn to the German officials and say, I have a lead on another Nazi war criminal. After all, that's what he's doing in Germany. But he knows that if he tells the German officials, if he tells the Foreign Office, that word will go back to the German embassy in Buenos Aires, and somebody will warn Eichmann, and Eichmann will disappear. And one of the reasons he knows this is probable is it's happened already with Dr. Mengele. And he's not willing to take a chance. So here is a man who decided after the war to go back to Germany to institute this war crimes process, who, when he gets this information on a major war criminal with direct connections to the final solution, turns, instead of to his fellow Germans, turns to Israeli officials. The Israeli representative, Israel did not then have diplomatic relations with Germany, to tell him this. The Israeli official passes it on to Israel, to Isser Harel, who was the head of the security services, and who's very close with David Ben-Gurion, the prime minister. And amazingly enough, or what seems to us amazing until we think about it, Harel gets this information and does nothing with it. Now, you might think, how could he not do anything and act on this information? Harel's reasoning was as follows. At the end of the 1950s, Israel was an exceptionally poor country. People who grew up in Israel at that time remembered there wasn't enough food. The Jewish state, for people to go hungry is quite amazing. he said, I have limited resources. And I can use those resources to defend Israel against current enemies who want to destroy us now, or I can use those resources to go against enemies who destroyed us in the past. And I think it's wiser to go against current enemies. So he does nothing. Bauer passes on more information, nothing happens. Harel at one point does ask an operative who's going to Argentina anyway to drive past this address where supposedly Eichmann lives. And the man writes back, this is such a ramshackled, poor little house, no electricity, no running water in a deserted area. This could not be the home of a man who had access to the possessions of so many countless numbers, hundreds of thousands, over 1 million Jews. It couldn't be, and Harel drops it again. Bauer is more convinced. Bauer's gotten also information from other sources, probably from other SS men who have passed this information on for whatever reason, for their own benefit. He comes to Israel finally, officially on an official state visit, but it's really to push Harel to act. He gives Harel information confirming that he thinks it's really Eichmann, gives him external corroborating information, and at that point Harel is convinced that it's Eichmann. Harel goes to David Ben-Gurion to tell him, and at that point another amazing thing, and the many amazing twists and interesting twists in the story. David Ben-Gurion gets this information. He could have done a number of things. He could have said, you know what, we'll forget about it. Well, he wasn't going to do that. But he could have also said, take some of your operatives, go down to Buenos Aires, and find the guy and kill him. And let him end up in a ditch. He lives in a on a deserted street. He probably picked that street to live on. It had a little hill, and he built a house where no other houses were around, so he could spot. The speculation is that he could spot others trying to approach if they did. He said, let him end up in a ditch. He could have said, let him end up in a ditch. You don't have to plant an Israeli flag on him and say we were here, but let it be a message to other war criminals. Don't sleep so soundly in your beds. We will find you. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but we will find you and we will extract justice, punishment. But Ben-Gurion didn't say that. Maybe we will extract punishment. Ben-Gurion said we will extract justice, find him, bring him back here, and we will put him on trial. Now, it was an amazing statement also because at that point, Argentina was one of the few South American countries with which Israel had good relations, had established diplomatic relations. And Ben-Gurion was taking a real chance there, but he felt it was important to do. They go, they capture him, they get him out of the country. There's an El Al plane that's coming to bring a delegation to the anniversary of Argentinian independence, and the delegation is brought by the El Al plane. The El Al plane is going to fly back the next day, and it takes Eichmann and his captors back with him, with the plane to Israel. Once the plane lands in Israel and Ben-Gurion is informed that he's here, there are all sorts of other issues that nobody's really thought about at that point to conducting this trial. First and foremost, Eichmann is taken to the prison in Akko, where he's held until the trial, and then he's moved to the prison in Ramleh. But first of all, who was going to conduct this trial? Israel at that point had a new attorney general. He had been attorney general as a political appointment, as in our country, and he had been the third choice of the various party coalitions in Israel, not a new thing. They had him then too, and he had been the third choice. He was a commercial lawyer from Tel Aviv. He had no experience trying criminal law. His name was Gideon Hausner, and everybody thought he might be the lead in name only, but he'd give the job to someone in his office who was an experienced criminal prosecutor. He said, no, I'm going to do it. The second question was, who was going to defend Eichmann? Israel knew that it had to allow Eichmann a strong defense, otherwise it would be a show trial, it would be a sham. And this, of course, was the time of the Stalinist or post-Stalinist communist show trials. It's post-Stalin, but still the communist show trials are a very vivid memory, and Israel didn't want to be accused of that. So it said to Eichmann, you can pick a lawyer, find a lawyer, but he can't be have been a member of the Nazi Party. Israel was very aware at the Nuremberg trials. Many of the lawyers had been ardent Nazis. many lawyers defending the Germans who were on trial, had been ardent Nazis, and Israel felt that this was just something it couldn't bear. It turns out the Eichmann family came up with the name of Robert Servatius, a lawyer in Germany who had actually defended some of the Nuremberg defendants, but had not been a member of the party, and they recommended him. That was fine with Israel, and but then came the question, who was going to pay Servatius? Generally, Germany would pay the expenses. The Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, would pay the expenses when a person was on trial outside the country, but Adenauer wanted nothing to do with this trial. Didn't want to have anything to do with this because he didn't want a German connection. I'll talk about that in a moment. So Israel ended up paying for Servatius's expenses. Then came the question of who's going to be the judge. By standard Israeli legal procedure, the president or the chief of the Jerusalem district court where the trial was going to be held should have been the judge. But that man, Judge Binyamin Halevi, had been the judge in the Kastner trial. The Kastner trial taken place a number of years early in the mid-50s. Kastner had been a Hungarian Jew who he felt libeled by another Jew in Hungary for having, quote unquote, collaborated with Eichmann. It's not really true that he collaborated, but that's what he was accused of. He sued this man for libel. He lost the libel case, and the judge in that case, Judge Halevi, said, "You sold your soul to the devil." He accused Kastner of collaborating. So for Halevi, who had already said, you sold your soul to the devil, and the devil was Eichmann, because that was with whom Kastner had negotiated, was too much. So Halevi, who refused to stand aside, but the Knesset passed a law that if there was a possibility of a death sentence, a judge from the high court had to preside. So Moshe Landau was chosen to preside, and Halevi became one of the other judges, and the head of the Tel Aviv district court was the third judge. Now, there's an interesting question which I should have touched on earlier. What law was Eichmann being charged under? The law was the 1950 law passed by the Knesset on the punishment of Nazis and their collaborators. Now, it's the only law in Israel which has the death penalty. But the question is, why was Israel passing a law on the punishment of Nazis and their collaborators, Nazi war criminals? Did it expect Nazi war criminals to show up in, Lud Airport, as the airport was then called, to say, try? No. The law was passed for two reasons. First of all, to bring Israel into sync with other European nations which had similar laws. But more importantly, because Israelis, the survivors, were coming forward and saying, I was in the supermarket in Tel Aviv, I was on the beach in Haifa, I was on the streets wherever, and I saw someone who was a capo in my barracks. I saw someone who turned and passed information on my family or something, and they wanted a mechanism to bring charges, and this law was instituted so that there could be, and actually were, such trials. Now, of course, once Israel had announced that it had found Eichmann, it didn't say it captured Eichmann, it said that their independent people, survivors, had found Eichmann and convinced him to come to Israel, One of the people who was involved in the capture said it was a Baba Maisa, a grandmother's story of first order. But, of course, an international debate broke out. First of all, Argentina was livid that its sovereignty had been violated, brought the case to the Security Council. Israel's foreign minister, Golda Meir, came to present Israel's case. And Argentina, in fact, the Argentinian representative of the UN had been a supporter of Mussolini, a fascist himself. So it was a very tense moment. But Israel essentially said, look, you have these people living under your nose and you didn't do anything to try to find them. At one point, it looked like the Security Council was going to say Israel had to return them, which I don't think it would have done. But at that point, Richard Nixon, then vice president, stepped in and said to America's representative to the Security Council, Henry Cabot Lodge, are you still interested in being my vice presidential running mate in 1960? He said, yes. Well, find some way to make this thing go away. What was decided, the other thing that frightened the United States and frightened Nixon and others was that any of the nations that had taken part in the Nuremberg trials, remember 4 nations tried with the joint tribunal, United States, France, England, and the Soviet Union, had a right to call for successor trials, for reopening of the Nuremberg trials. And the Soviet Union began to make noise about calling for a successor trial for Eichmann. And that's all the United States in 1960 did not want to be sitting on a joint tribunal with the Soviet Union. So that was another reason to try to find this way to resolve this. And so the other nations came up with a solution that Argentina would accept Israel's apology, and that would be its compensation, and Israel would keep Eichmann. Or as one pundit put it, Argentina got its apology and Israel got its man. So. But what about Germany? Other people said, well, what right does Israel have to try this? It didn't exist when these crimes were committed. It wasn't committed, they weren't committed on its soil. They weren't committed against Israeli citizens because there were no Israeli citizens at that time. It shouldn't be in Israel. Now, there were 2 responses to this. One response was, where else should it be? There was no international criminal court. There was an international court, but that international court was only set up, and I know I'm speaking in front of a lawyer, but to hear cases between nations. I got that right? I'm getting the president's nod, so maybe you'll invite me back yet a 3rd time. But there was no international venue. As people said, it should be tried in Germany. But as I said earlier, Adenauer didn't want this trial in Germany. Adenauer didn't want any connection with this trial. Adenauer's government was riddled with former Nazis. His chief of staff, the head of the chancellery, was a man named Hans Globke, who had been in the Ministry of Justice under the Third Reich. He had written the Nuremberg laws. And all Adenauer feared was that Eichmann would, if the trial was in Germany, Eichmann would get up and say, you're trying me? What about Hans Globke? What about this one? What about that one? And he wanted no connection with this trial. So that there really was no other venue, on top of which Israel's answer was not just that there's no other venue. Israel's answer was Eichmann was part of an effort to destroy the Jewish people. This is the Jewish state. It has the largest number of people in the world in one place who were directly impacted by the Holocaust, either as survivors or as people who lost their whole family. What other venue is better than this venue? What other venue? He said, if someone had tried to wipe out the nation of France and Frenchmen all over the world, would you question whether the trial should be in France? And then another complaint that people raised was that, well, it couldn't be a fair trial because the court would have Jewish judges. Now, as Hannah Arendt, who was a great critic of this trial, said, you know, it's interesting. Nobody raised that question when the Poles had trials right after the war. Nobody raised that question when the Czechs had trials after the war, and they had suffered terribly at the hands of the Nazis. How come it's being raised now that it's Jews? Moreover, the judges answered this when Servatius brought it up at the trial, and the judges said, and something which makes great sense, they said, judges are compelled every single case to sit, and not in all cases is it as bad, but to sit in judgment of cases on actions which they find abhorrent. And they have to set aside their personal feelings about the nature of the crime and judge according to the law. And they said, and we have to do that in this case. So then it's time really to put together the indictment, and Hausner steps forward it's his job to put forward the indictment, and he looks at the Nuremberg trials, which had taken place in the immediate aftermath of the war, and he essentially looks at the indictment there, and there the indictment had been waging a war of aggression, crimes against peace, conspiracy, and the 4th one had been crimes against humanity. Today we talk so much about the crimes against humanity clause of the Nuremberg trials. Truth is, it was really an afterthought or an add-on. And he turns it around. And the crimes against humanity were crimes against mentally handicapped, against Roma and Sinti, gypsies as we call them, and others, and amongst them Jews. It was sort of part of a litany. He says the first crime is going to be crimes against the Jewish people, the attempt to destroy the Jewish people, and then he added the other crimes as well, but making that promise. But that's not the only thing he did, which was so important. He also looked at the Nuremberg trials, and he said the Nuremberg trials relied primarily on documents. I believe it was Justice Jackson who was our representative, the American prosecutor at Nuremberg. And by the way, just parenthetically, this is how significant America and Harry Truman, who just became president, thought the Nuremberg trials would be. He asked the sitting Supreme Court justice to take a leave from the court to be the American prosecutor at Nuremberg. So it was something that was seen as quite significant. But the tendency, and not the inclination, the decision in Nuremberg on the part of the prosecutors was to rely on documents. Because documents were felt to be more legitimate. Documents felt to be more trustworthy. You couldn't trust victims to really tell the story and to get it just right. So the main there were virtually no witnesses at Nuremberg who were victims of the people who were on trial. Hausner decided to do something else with a push by a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto who was in fact collecting amongst the earliest survivor accounts of what happened, a woman named Rachel Auerbach who worked at Yad Vashem, to rely on witnesses. And he decided to tell the whole story of the final solution. He believed that Eichmann was the architect of the final solution, so he could tell the whole story. Even if he couldn't connect Eichmann to certain parts of it, he was wrong on that. Wrong on that Eichmann was the architect. But he called 104 witnesses, of whom 96, 97 were survivors, to give testimony, to essentially tell the story of the Holocaust from its inception all the way through to its ultimate impact. And the survivors came and told their story, and they had made a compelling impression on not just people in the courtroom, but people listening to it on the radio and people seeing. This is the first trial ever to be televised. It's not live. It's recorded each night, and the tapes are flown out of Israel to London, where copies are then provided to Germany, to London, and then sent to the United States, so that 24 hours later, the next night, you would see things on television. But I'd just like to talk a little bit about this whole survivor testimony, because I think it's amongst the most important aspects of the trial. It's a non-judicial aspect because the judges won't rely on it in their decision, but in its long-term impact, it really has a tremendous impact on our telling the story, on our listening to the voice of the survivor. And amongst the people who come to give testimony is a professor, a French professor, Georges Valère. Georges Valère had been incarcerated in Drancy in the summer of '42. Many of you know about the roundups in the summer of '42. And you know that many of the children were separated from their parents. And he describes how he goes to, in Drancy, he goes to where the camp where the children are being held, and he takes with him René Blum, the brother of Leon Blum, who had been Prime Minister of France and had been assassinated. And they go and they describe the situation in which they find the children. The children slept, he tells the court, over 100 to a room, on straw mattresses on the ground. Mattresses which were filthy, disgusting, and full of vermin, many with no adult allowed nearby. It was not uncommon for them to awake during the night screaming for their parents. Some were too young to know their own names. Since they had already been interned in other camps, their state of cleanliness was frightful. This was compounded by the waves of diarrhea that affected many of them. We spoke, he told the court, with one boy who was remarkably handsome, with a face which was very intelligent. He wore clothes which must have been once of very good quality, rather stylish, but now in a pitiful condition. When we asked about his parents, the boy said, "My father goes to the office and Mummy plays the piano." So came from a obviously comfortable home. We reassured him that he would soon rejoin his parents, though we both knew that the child was headed for Auschwitz. The little boy happily showed us a biscuit he was saving for his mother. Bloom bent over the little boy, who looked very happy, very engaging. Bloom took the little boy's face in his hand and wanted to stroke his head. And at that moment, the child, who only a moment ago had been so happy, burst into tears. That one human touch, and the child lost it. And when the time came, Valère went on, for that deportation, many of the children fought and had to be brought to the roundup place, struggling and screaming. Another witness who came to give testimony was then a young magistrate named Moshe Beisky. Moshe Beisky will go on to become a very respected member of Israel's High Court. And Moshe Beisky was very much respected, even before he came to Israel, for having passed up opportunities to escape. He had been incarcerated at Plaszow. Plaszow, the labor camp in Krakow. Many of you know it from Schindler's List. It's not Auschwitz, but it's a camp right in Krakow. And he knew he had a chance to escape, and he didn't escape because he knew Amnon Goth, the head of Plaszow, would extract collective punishment, probably death, on the 80 other prisoners in the barrack if Beisky escaped. So when Beisky enters the witness box, Moshe Landau, the presiding judge, says to him, "You may sit." And he says, "No, I prefer to stand." He's a magistrate. He's a man of the court. He feels he owes the court a certain modicum of that respect of standing. And he proceeds to give testimony. His testimony is on YouTube. You can listen to it. He proceeds to speak in not just full sentences, but full paragraphs. He's giving exactly the kind of testimony you would want, the facts and to the facts, etc. And he at one point, he describes how in Plaszow, 15,000 prisoners were ordered by SS men to gather and to watch as a young boy was brought to be hanged. And Beisky tells the court, "The child was lifted up to the gallows, but the rope broke. Here he was again lifted onto a high chair, which was placed under the rope. The child began to beg for mercy, but an order was given to hang him a second time." And he's describing this harrowing scene when suddenly into the midst, Hausner pounces. He interrupts him and he says, Hausner says, 15,000 people stood there and opposite them hundreds of guards. Why didn't you attack? Why didn't you revolt? Now, Hausner's question was something that was in the minds of many Israelis. Many Israelis had this sense that, 13 years ago, Israel was then in its what we call bar mitzvah year, 13 years old. 14 years ago, we fought, we held off against 5 Arab armies. We fought. We were strong. What was wrong with these Jews that they didn't fight back? Now, of course, what many Israelis, young Israelis, were forgetting when they made these statements is that the people who held off these 5 Arab armies, many of them were survivors who, as soon as they arrived in Israel, were brought to defend the then fledgling state. But also, there was this sense of, these were disparagingly, quote unquote, ghetto Jews. These were Jews. These were the pre-new Jew Israel, Sabra kind of Jews. And I don't think Hausner was asking his question out of that mode. I think what Hausner wanted to do was show the Jews who had that kind, the Israelis who had that kind of perception of the witnesses, that this was a whole different situation. That these people had been abandoned by everyone. And he was going to get that answer by challenging a witness such as Beisky. And Beisky was taken aback. You can see in the videotapes, he's taken aback by, and he writes about it afterwards, by Hausner's question. And he struggled to respond. And so the articulate witness is suddenly, this articulate witness who's been testifying so eloquently is suddenly replaced by a man who struggles for words and who leaves sentences unfinished. This was already, and in fact, the court reporter leaves ellipses, and to show I didn't miss what he said, he didn't finish his sentence. This was already in the 3rd year of the war. Nevertheless, there was still hope. Here were people working on forced labor. They apparently needed this work, possibly, maybe. And then mid-sentence, he turns to Moshe Landau and he says, "May I sit down?" The man who had, for 45 minutes, had been standing there erect, giving testimony, suddenly is brought back to that moment and sits down. And then he goes on to say, I cannot describe this terror-inspiring fear. Nearby us, there was a Polish camp. There were 1,000 Poles. 100 meters beyond the camp, they had a place to go to, their homes. I don't recall one instance of escape on the part of the Poles, but where could any of us Jews go? We were wearing clothes which were dyed yellow with yellow stripes. The hair at their center, they made a kind of swath and a stripe 4 centimeters in width. And at that moment, let us suppose that the 15,000 people within the camp even succeeded, without armed strength, to go beyond the boundaries of the camp. Where could they go? What could they do? And remember, they weren't all Poles. So many of them didn't even speak Polish, the language. And after I read that testimony, I photocopied Baisky's testimony. And I slipped it into the folder in which I carry my lectures on the history of the Holocaust back and forth from class, because I know that at some point that I'm going to talk on Tuesday when I'm back in class in Atlanta on resistance. And some student will ask in some way, maybe more genteelly, maybe less genteelly, why didn't, quote unquote, they fight back? And I've used it before, Baisky's testimony, to give my students, it's easy for them to ask that question, sitting in the comfort of the classroom, secure, feeling strong. Sometimes I say to them, I'm going to ask you a question. I don't want you to answer it even in your head, which of course makes it impossible. And I said, imagine you're in a ghetto, imagine you're in a camp, primarily in a ghetto with your family, and you're the only one with a work permit, and you have a chance to escape. But you know that if you escape, your family's going to be deported. Now, deportation is coming anyway, probably, but it would come right away for your family if you do that. Do you escape or don't you escape? Don't answer even to yourself, because you can't answer unless you're in that situation. But in other words, I think what Hausner was trying to do with that question was to extract from the Israeli public a modicum of modesty, in the sense of, these people, what was wrong with these people was not who they were or where they came from, but they were chronologically and geographically challenged. Or in other words, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and there was no one around to help them in any way. And in fact, in the trial, the Warsaw Ghetto comes up quite a lot. And it is, the first armed resistance, not the first armed resistance by Jews, the first armed resistance anywhere in Europe against the Nazis. So it's quite striking in that sense, but I think that's what Hausner was trying to do there. There were other moments in the trial of evidence that was very compelling. One of the most moving moments came when a pastor, let me just find this, the then chief pastor, the dean of the church in Berlin, came to give a testimony. When he had been a pastor in Berlin of a church in Berlin, Hans Gruber, during the war, and he had many converts to Christianity, Jewish converts to Christianity in his church. And Heinrich Gruber, I'm sorry, not Hans, Heinrich Gruber. And in this capacity, he had often gone to Eichmann to negotiate with Eichmann on behalf of the converts, who, of course, in the Nazis' eyes were Jews. And he was trying to keep them from being deported, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually he's imprisoned and tortured. He's imprisoned in Sachsenhausen and Dachau. And he described for the court as Eichmann as a block of ice, someone who was impossible to get through to him and impossible to get any kindness or anything from him. And he, after he gave his testimony, very compelling testimony, he turned to Moshe Landau and he asked for permission to say a few words, a personal statement. And even before he did that, something else very dramatic happened in his testimony. He talked about a man who was still alive who had helped Jews in Berlin, who helped Jews hide, etc. He said, but he didn't want to mention his name to spare him any trouble. So Judge Halevi said, I don't understand. Wouldn't it have been an honor to be one of those who helped Jews hide? And Gruber said, when it was announced in the German press that he, Gruber, was coming to testify against Eichmann, he had received, quote, a thick file of threatening and insulting letters from fellow Germans. This is in 1961. So in 1961, Gruber feels it's still necessary to hide the name of other Germans who had hid, we just spoke about those who put their risked their lives to hide people. In 61, it still was a danger to be known as that. But then after those statements, he turned to Landau and asked for this permission to make a personal statement. And he said, as the first German citizen, non-Jew, to stand before this high court, and one who found it hard to come here, my heartfelt prayer is that we see to it that forgiving love in Israel and forgiven sin in Germany shall meet before the throne of the Lord. And spectators wept, and the people of Israel, adults, children, showered him with cards and with letters and with notes, and it gave them a sense that they were not alone. And it was a very dramatic moment. Another dramatic moment was when the son of the former chief rabbi of Denmark came to give testimony. You know the story of Denmark and the rescue of the Jews of Denmark. And he told how on the Erev Rosh Hashanah, the night of Rosh Hashanah, his father was informed by a Danish official, probably been told by a sympathetic German official, that the Jews were about to be deported. So Rosh Hashanah night, when Jews came to the synagogue, he told them, don't go home. Go to if you have a country home, go to your country home, go to neighbors, don't go home. They're coming with the addresses to round you up. And of course, over the next few weeks, the Jews were ferried across to Sweden. And he talked about how never in his entire time during the war had there been such a sense of solidarity in Denmark as during those days. And he described Erev Rosh Hashanah, the day he knew that night his father was making the announcement. And he had been a student at the university. He had some library books, which he felt he knew he was escaping to Sweden. He had to return. And I would say that was aggravated. If there are any librarians here, I'm not against returning library books. I fully believe that library books should be returned, but I think if you know you're about to be deported, you get a pass, right? But he went to return the books, and he said he wasn't at the university more than 10 to 15 minutes, and in the space of that time, two groups of students came up to him, students he didn't know, who said, we know who you are, here's how to get in touch with us. Should you need anything, contact us. And as he told his story, one of the reporters, Chaim Guri, who was there, who wrote on the trial each day, beautiful pieces, was sitting behind a woman who was weeping and weeping. And at one point he leaned over to her and he said, Madam, may I help you? Is something wrong? And she said, no, I always weep when people are kind to me. So she was hearing a story of kindness, and it evoked from her that reaction. I don't have time. I could have spent the whole hour here talking about Hannah Arendt, but I want to talk about her just briefly. She, of course, was a German Jew, left Germany in the early 30s, shortly after the Nazis came to power, was in France, and then escaped and came to this country. She had been a visiting professor at Princeton, and then spent her career at the University of Chicago. Wrote the Origins of Totalitarianism, a book that really established her intellectual reputation. When the trial was announced, she decided she really felt compelled to go and cover it, and she got the New Yorker to pay for her to go and write about it. And she wrote some very critical things about the trial, calling it a show trial, saying Ben-Gurion was manipulating it. I think she got a lot, but then she wrote about the Judenrat, the Jewish councils in the ghettos, calling them collaborators. Now, many of the Jews in the ghettos hated the Jewish councils, but she sort of wrote of them in one fell swoop. There were thousands of them. Some were terrible, some were better, and she wrote of them even as the equivalent of Nazis, practically. She said the Jews in the ghetto faced two enemies, the Jewish councils and the Judenrat. The reason she was one amongst the reasons she was so critical of them is many of them made up the lists of who should be deported. In part, they were between a rock and a hard place. I don't want to judge, but the Nazis came to them and said, we're going to take 15,000 people tomorrow. Either you'll tell us which 15,000 people, or we're just going to come in and round them up. And she felt that because of their collaboration, she called it collaboration, more Jews died than in any other place. It's not true. In Russia, there were no Jewish councils. And millions of and over 1 million Jews were killed by the Einsatz group and by the mobile killing units. She was very, very critical, but she also said some other things which in the criticism of her have been lost, and I want to focus on those just for the moment. First of all, she talked about the importance of this trial. What was the importance of this trial? And she was very much supportive of having this trial in Israel. She thought the criticism of it not being there was silly. She said, for the first time since the year 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, Jews were able to sit in judgment on crimes committed against their own people. For the first time, they did not need to appeal to others for protection and justice, or fall back upon the compromised phraseology of the rights of man. Rights which, as no one knew better than they, were claimed only by people who were too weak to defend their rights and enforce their own laws. And in that one paragraph, Ben-Gurion couldn't have said it better. She really captured what this was the first time since the destruction of the Second Temple that Jews could sit in judgment of a non-Jew who had done them wrong, and didn't have to go to another authority and say, well, the rights of man says you should punish this person, supplicate for punishment, for justice for what had been done to them. They could do it on their own. And there's something else that she said there that I also found exceptionally, and I was reminded of it this evening as I watched the students, particularly, not everyone, but particularly the students participating in the service that preceded my talk. And it was a reaction she had to testimony given by Abba Kovner. Abba Kovner was the leader of the Vilna Ghetto resistance. At the age of 19 or 20, he was the first person, not the first Jew, the first person in Europe to call for armed uprising against the Nazis. He did it in December 1941. And Kovner, the Vilna Ghetto resistance fails. Kovner escapes. He becomes part of a resistance group. And after the war, he comes to Israel, where he's a kibbutznik, and he becomes one of Israel's leading poets. So from the Israeli perspective, he has all the necessary qualities: a man of the soil, a man of letters, and a resistance fighter. It's perfect, you know, that's the GQ man in Israeli, to use a, I mean, I don't know. I don't mean that. I have great awe of Kovner, so I don't know. That'll keep me up tonight. But in any case, Arendt hates his testimony because it's not testimony. Even the judges hated it. It's theatrics. He comes and he gives a speech, and Hausner tries to get him to answer questions, and he just ignores Hausner and gives his speech. But there's one moment in Kovner's testimony which struck Arendt as very powerfully. She writes, when he talks about a German sergeant named Anton Schmidt. Anton Schmidt was a German sergeant who was assigned to Vilna and secretly helped the resistance, providing them with arms, providing them with uniforms, with materiel, false papers. And he did this for a number of months till he was caught and shot. And he would never take any money in payment for what he was doing. And so when Kovner tells his story, this is the moment that Arendt describes it as follows. A hush settled over the courtroom. It was as though the crowd had spontaneously decided to observe the usual 2 minutes of silence in honor of the man named Anton Schmidt. And in those 2 minutes, which were like a sudden burst of light in the midst of impenetrable, unfathomable darkness, a single thought stood out clearly, irrefutable, beyond question. How utterly different everything would be today in this courtroom, in Israel, in Germany, in all of Europe, and perhaps in all the countries of the world, if only more such stories could have been told. And if there is a quote-unquote lesson of this genocide, that's the central one. If there had been more Anton Schmidts, there would have been a different ending to this story. And she goes on to say it. She says, when faced with Nazi-like terror, most people will comply. But then she puts it in italics. But some people will not. The final solution, she writes, could have happened in most places. But once again, it did not happen everywhere. And humanely speaking, no more is required, and no more can reasonably be asked for this planet to remain a place fit for human habitation. The ability to say no, the ability not to go along, the ability to say no, especially at the beginning when it's possible to say no. And that was her comment. One last final thing before I close and leave a little time for questions. What about Eichmann's defense? He gives a very vigorous defense. And partially when his lawyer is questioning, but in the cross-examination, at times he bests Hausner. But at the very end of the trial, the judges, in a trial of this magnitude, especially with the death sentences, the judges ask questions of the defendant. They ask questions of the defendant not as a way of a cross-examination, but as a way of making sure that they understood exactly what had been said. There were two dramatic moments. Ravez started, the youngest judge goes first to the senior judge, and he talks about the fact that Eichmann, when he was being questioned by the police, talked about his belief in Kant's categorical imperative. And to sum it up, and if there are any professors of philosophy here, I apologize for giving a very quick summation, but essentially what Kant was stating, is that everyone should live their lives according to standards that could be raised to universal law for everyone. And then you would have a moral society. Sort of do unto others as you would have others do unto you, and that becomes the law. And so first Raveh asks him about this, and he says, well, yes, I wanted to live my life according to that, but during the war I saw that I could not, which essentially was saying I knew I was doing wrong, but I went ahead and did it anyway. But it was in the exchange with Judge Halevi, which to me is the most dramatic. Halevi says to him very quietly and very low-keyed, you were not, let me just find it here. Now, you personally were not an anti-Semite, were you? And Eichmann says no. And then Halevi goes on and says, in fact, you helped some Jews. And Eichmann says yes. He said you had an aunt by marriage, a step-aunt, Dorothy, whose daughter was considered half Jewish, and you helped her escape to Switzerland. He said yes, and those were not the only ones. I helped a couple in Vienna, I helped this. And then Halevi paused and just for a second, and he said, so when you didn't want to follow orders, you didn't have to. Of course, his defense had been, and Eichmann immediately said, oh, there were only a few cases. And Halevi says, no need to apologize, no need to apologize. But with that, his defense really collapsed. The trial, of course, was a death sentence. He's the only person. Two people have been sentenced to death in Israel. Only one has, in one case, has the death sentence been carried out. The second was John Dumyanyuk, who was released by, as I was telling some people earlier this evening, was released by the High Court in Israel because there was question about the testimony. There was no question that he had been a guard. There was no question that he had done terrible things. But the High Court said that there was questions about certain the evidence, and as a democratic country, they were forced to let him go, even though they knew for sure that he was a Nazi, a war criminal. What was the impact of this trial? The impact of this trial was less in the judicial nature of it, and I think more in the testimony of the survivors. It wasn't that survivors hadn't spoken before that. Many of them had, though more did speak about it afterwards. But it was that this was the first time the world listened. The world paid attention. The world heard the story from the beginning to the end. I don't want to say that at that moment there's a flip and there's a great interest in the final solution after that, but it's the beginning of a process, much of which we see culminating in 1990 in the establishment of this guest lectureship here at Elmhurst College and in other places as well, the Holocaust Museum here, Washington, and in other places. The idea of telling the story, the idea of the survivor and listening to the survivor. And I'd like to close with how I close my book. A number of years ago, I was invited to a conference at Yad Vashem. While there, I met a group of young Rwandans who had asked Yad Vashem to train them in how to conduct oral testimony with trauma victims. They wanted to ensure that the history of the genocide that had decimated their country and their families would be preserved. Yad Vashem, eager to make them feel comfortable, arranged for them to have dinner on their first night in Jerusalem with French-speaking Holocaust survivors. By the end of the dinner, the two groups of survivors had bonded so strongly that the elderly survivors took the young Rwandans under their wings, invited them to their homes, introduced them to their families, and began to build personal relations. One afternoon, I sat with some of the Rwandans outside of Yad Vashem, looking out over the Judean hills. They told me of their experiences during the genocide and of their meeting with Holocaust survivors. One young man whose entire family had been murdered said to me, "I want to tell my story and help my fellow Rwanda survivors tell theirs. Just like the Holocaust survivors, I want people to listen to me as they listen to them." And despite the inherent contradiction in his next statement, I completely understood what he said. I had heard it many times before from Holocaust survivors. Future generations, those who were not there, must remember. And we who were there must tell them. This may be the most enduring legacy of what occurred in Jerusalem in 1961. Thank you very much.
Don't run off.
Thank you.
For the joys of this night and for the fact that you came back introducing us to many things, including the fact that we have a lot to do here at this college still, and you have helped bring us along. Deborah, please receive this small little token of a gift from us. And will you join me in thanking Professor Lipstadt one more time, please? Professor Lipstadt has books that she is willing to sign if you form a line here. And there is also an amazing scroll of fires, of amazing artwork that is over here that I'd invite you to come by. And Sue Ellen Rocock is here, and she might even be able to help give you a few words about this. Before you start running, please, let me offer just a few things. One, at the end of the program, you should note, please, not only all the activities that are going to be coming in the rest of this week, especially for a spiritual life counseling for all the students on Wednesday at 5 o'clock in the Bloom Room. I also want to call your attention to the page that says something about the people that have given so generously to make this. Along with the Schwartzes that are here, along with Carol Hillman, along with so many others that have been a part of the life of this place. The college has benefited greatly from the generosity of a number of individuals and for the support that the college continues to see as this being primary to the work of core values, as Dr. Ray lifted up. And so I would like to recall to you also, because some of us are still remembering with great love and affection, our trustee Abner Gannett, who has passed away, who was a blessing to this college as a trustee and also liberated the camp that Elie Wiesel was in. And that story of that wonderful, amazing man is now going to be immortalized in the chapel with another plaque that will recognize his work, his legacy, and his life. Many of you helped to fund that. For that, I am extremely thankful. There are many things to look forward to. I invite you to join me in a closing moment of silence and final prayer. For lights that are shining, for candles that are lit, for our lives that might make a difference, for the ability to say no, the ability to say yes. On this night of Yom HaShoah around the world, we hold before you all those who have perished and our work here at this college. Take us into the night with joy and thankfulness for this evening, for Deborah and her witness, and for ours. Let us rise tomorrow and again be witnesses to light and candles and life. We have been given this day to step forward. As we pray in your holy name, amen. Thank you all for coming. A blessed night to all. Please join us for greet our guest, Deborah Lipstadt, please.
Hi, I'm John Quigley, President and CEO of the Elmhurst Chamber of Commerce and Industry. In these challenging economic times, it's imperative that our residents and businesses band together to not only shop Elmhurst, but by Elmhurst whenever possible. We have great stores in our city center, Spring Road, Butterfield Road, York and Villette Streets, St. Charles and Route 83, North Avenue and Lake Street, along North York and even Grand Avenue. I ask for your help. Let's keep our tax dollars in Elmhurst.
The Churchville Schoolhouse opens the door to the best education in history. Visitors to the Churchville Schoolhouse take a step back in time to watch history unfold in a restored National Register of Historic Places property that dates to the Civil War era. Students of today walk in the footsteps of local farm children from the early days of DuPage County for an authentic living history experience led by a schoolmarm of the early 1900s. A visit to the Churchville Schoolhouse is hands-on, educational, and fun. Participants use slate chalkboards and McGuffey readers for the day's lessons. And children will be asked to follow proper classroom etiquette. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are practiced, and students test their skills during an old-fashioned spelling bee. And of course, no school day is complete without recess featuring games of the early 1900s. The schoolhouse is a popular place for scouts and day camps too. Group visits can also be arranged for service clubs, tour groups, and other adult organizations. The Churchville Schoolhouse Living History program is operated by the Elmhurst Historical Museum. Call the museum today to book a field trip or find out more information. Call 630-833-1457 or visit our website at churchvilleschoolhouse.org. The Churchville Schoolhouse is waiting to open the doors for your school or community group. Plan a memorable learning experience today for the best education in history.